Lee Hood, welcome to the Inquiring Mind podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's an honor to have you on the podcast. I'm glad we could set this up. Before we get started with anything, I have a lot of questions, a lot of topics to get to. Can you give a brief introduction as to what you do and who you are?
I'm Lee Hood. I'm a professor at the Institute for Systems Biology, which I started 20 years ago, the first that really pioneered this new approach to biology and medicine. And I'm also Chief Science Officer for Providence St. Joseph's, a major community health system with 51 hospitals, 25,000 docs, and about 10 million patients or so.
Wow.
And my interests really are on wellness, population health, and new approaches to dealing with disease.
Mm-hmm. And before we get into what you just mentioned, what first got you into science? Was there a time when you were young? What got you hooked?
Well, I had actually several experiences when I was in high school in Shelby, Montana, school with 146 students. And first of all, my father was an electrical engineer that was directing the distribution of microwave repeater stations across the state of Montana. And he actually taught summer classes in electrical engineering and computer science to his telephone men in Denver. I used to go down and take some of those classes. And they actually taught me a lot about engineering that has been very useful in how I thought about biology.
Mm-hmm.
The second experience was my grandfather actually constructed and then managed a camp in southwestern Montana in the Beartooth Mountains for geology faculty and students, summer courses from Princeton and Yale and Harvard. And I spent 3 years there working and actually did a project on an oil anticline, geologically mapping it in Wyoming. And that project took me to the Westinghouse Science Talent Search in Washington, D.C. So it gave me my first introduction to scientists. But perhaps the most striking experience was my senior year when my chemistry teacher asked me to help teach sophomores biology. And I did so out of articles in Scientific American, one of which was on the structure of DNA just 3 years after Watson and Crick had discovered it. And that really made me decide I wanted to go into biology. Anything as elegant as DNA and the fact that it somehow encoded all the information for building humans was utterly fascinating. And this same high school teacher actually said, well, if you're really interested in biology, the place you should go is Caltech, where he'd gone during World War II as a Navy navigator. And he decided it was such a terrific place. Any good students he had, he'd certainly try and shunt them there. And I went to Caltech, and that started me in a career of science.
And what was your experience like at Caltech?
Caltech was absolutely terrific. So on the one hand, I played football in high school, and at Caltech, I played football. And in my high school team, and it was a very small team, I was probably the third or fourth best person on the team at Caltech. I was close to the best person on the team. So it was fun. And it was a stimulating experience because our 4 home games a year were all played in the Rose Bowl. So you can imagine 50 students from Caltech in a stadium for 105,000 cheering the Caltech team on. So it was an experience. Academically, it taught me the basic tools I needed: chemistry, physics, mathematics, and it had very good fundamental biology, but really no human biology at all. And in fact, that is the reason I decided I'd go to medical school, not to become a doctor, but rather to learn about human biology, because I was convinced that's where I wanted to do my research.
Hmm. And throughout your time in medical school, did you have second thoughts? Do you think maybe I should become a doctor?
I never had the faintest second thought, but I did learn fascinating topics about human biology. I became really intrigued with the immune system, and that's where I spent the focus of the first part of my career. I was absolutely fascinated by what little we understood of cancer, and very poorly understood at that time, but human genetics.
Yeah.
So after Hopkins medical school, I went back then to Caltech and got my PhD in biochemistry, but I did molecular immunology, and it was a wonderful choice and an exciting 4-year career at Caltech, as I really discovered some of the fundamental secrets of how the immune system works and everything. And after Caltech, got an independent position at NIH, National Institutes of Health, and the Cancer Institute, and set up my own lab, and again did molecular immunology there. So it tidied me over very well.
Wonderful. I have to kind of start this. I have to say this early on in the podcast. I am not a doctor. I am not even close to a doctor. I don't have any medical or science degree. I'm just a curious person that wants to learn more about what you do. So, pardon me if I ask some very simple questions,
No
because
problem.
let's start with what you just mentioned, molecular immunology. Can you explain what molecular immunology is and why it piqued your interest early on?
Well, it piqued my interest early on because in doing reading, I became fascinated with the fact the immune system has the ability to recognize virtually any of a whole world of different foreign pathogens, bacteria, viruses, and even cancer cells. And the whole question of how it did this was fascinating. And by that time, it had been discovered that antibodies, these are protein molecules made by antibody producing cells, were one of the mediators of specificity. And it turned out that each antibody producing cell could make a different type of antibody molecule with different specificities. And the question was, what did these antibody molecules look like, and what did their diversity look like? And I happened to read a paper about a person at NIH that was studying tumors of antibody producing cells that produced homogeneous antibodies. And you could actually characterize the structure of these. And that's what my PhD work was about. And that's what my early work at NIH was all about, looking at the structures of these specific molecules and trying to figure out how the body made molecules that were so diverse they could recognize nearly a million different kinds of, or more, different kinds of antigens. And that was what I studied really for the first 20 years of my career from a biological point of view.
Mm. And what did you learn in that time?
So what we learned is that evolution had fashioned a most unique series of approaches for the diversification of these antibody molecules. First of all, each antibody was made by two different genes the variable recognition unit and the more constant adapter unit. And that in the genome, there were tens to hundreds of these variable genes. But when they got put together, that activated mutational processes that further diversified these molecules. So in a sense, when a foreign bacteria came into the body, it would induce the activation of cells that could make antibodies against the foreign determinant, the bacteria. And in the course of doing that, the cells threw off other cells with diversified forms of the molecule that was initially activated, and they got tighter and tighter binding properties. That is, they were more efficient at destroying the bacteria. And so we discovered the we first formulated the 2-gene 1 polypeptide chain hypothesis. And then we were among the first to clone the genes that encoded these separate units. We discovered how the diversity was generated in these molecules. And about that time, it was clear that there were not only B cells and antibodies, but there were T cells and their receptors that did immune recognition for different classes of antigens and so forth. And we went on to study the T cell receptors and indeed other classes of immune receptors, and discovered and delineated many of the fundamental mechanisms for how antibodies were diversified so you could be protected against the entire universe of foreign bacteria and viruses and so forth.
Mm-hmm. And from what I gather, you then it led to the Human Genome Project. Is that correct?
Well, not quite, because
okay.
when I went from NIH to Caltech in 1970, I kind of sat back and decided I really wanted to forge a new direction in my career. So I continued with molecular immunology, but then I adapted half of my lab to technology development. And the reason I did that is because I was, again, really interested in understanding human biology, but I was daunted by the enormous complexity of human beings. And in thinking deeply about it, I decided it was very much like the elephant and the 6 blind men, each feeling a different part of the elephant and saying it was a spear or it was a fan or it was a stump. It was very much how physicians treated patients. That is, they made a very few measurements, they looked at the outside, and they didn't begin to touch the real complexity of human beings. And I had decided at that time the key to deciphering this complexity was being able to make many, many measurements on human beings. And that led me to a series of technologies that enabled us to be able to actually do that. So, for example, over a period of 25 years, my lab developed 6 instruments that allowed you to read and to write DNA and proteins in new and more powerful kinds of ways. And this gave us the ability to make many measurements on humans. And indeed, those measurements were the beginning of the creation of big data in human biology that we all know about and understand today. Mm-hmm. But the second question was, okay, you had all of this data on a human. What did it mean? And that's where I began to think about something that came to fruition much later, systems biology, how you integrate different types of data and how you translate that data into the biological networks that underpin human biology and aging and development and ultimately disease and everything. So the first paradigm change and there were 7 of them that I was involved in, was developing the instruments, bringing engineering to biology that enabled us to begin dealing with complexity. And the second paradigm change was the Human Genome Project, because one of my instruments was the automated DNA sequencer, which was what made it possible to sequence, to map the human genome in its entirety. And of course, that was a very exciting project because it, for the first time, defined all the genes in a human. And we learned that there were only about 20,000, which was surprisingly small. But two, we defined a lot of the human genetic variability, and that gave us the ability to look at wellness and disease phenotypes and determine the genes that actually encoded those different phenotypes. So it opened up the powerful tools of genetics to understanding wellness and understanding disease. And a third paradigm change was essentially developing a cross-disciplinary department of biology, the first ever at the University of Washington, where Bill Gates gave us the money to move and to start that department, which was spectacularly successful in the 8 years of existence in developing new tools for the genome and for the emerging proteome, for cell biology and many other things. But at that time, I realized that what I really wanted to do was pioneer systems biology. And that discipline was so different from other areas of biology that in the end, I resigned from the University of Washington in 2000 and started the Institute for Systems Biology, which pioneered these things. And of course, that was the fourth paradigm change. And of course, systems thinking led us to think much more deeply about healthcare. And there we conceptualized the idea that healthcare should be predictive, preventive, personalized, and participatory, P4. And that P4 actually had two domains, wellness and disease. And in the early 2000s, wellness was almost entirely ignored. So in about 2014 and 15, we put together population studies to study wellness by taking each individual and generating their complete genome sequence, and then analyzing blood analytes and the gut microbiome and digital health features to give us longitudinal data clouds, taking these data at every 6-month period, that gave us deep insights into both wellness and into disease. And in fact, what that led to was an understanding of science-driven wellness or quantitative wellness. And we had new approaches to thinking about disease as well. So when in 2016, I was offered the possibility of joining Providence as its chief science officer, I immediately dreamed up the idea that we would go from the 5,000 patients we had initially examined in this way to 1 million patients, which we'd examine over a 5 to 8 year period. And that was the final paradigm change. That is, in a sense, carrying out the second Human Genome Project, where we went from 1 genome to 1 million, and where we use not just genome DNA sequencing, but the analysis of proteins and the analysis of metabolites and the gut microbiome and all these other things we can do. And we believe that's going to lead to a 21st century vision of medicine where we'll use data-driven approaches to follow for each individual their health trajectory across their life and be able to optimize wellness and minimize disease from this data-driven approach. So that's really what I'm aiming to do, is to achieve this million-person project and to be able to transform healthcare in a major way.
Yeah, and how ambitious is the 1 million? What goes into um, that 1 million person number? Like, how much effort is it? And is it outside the realm of possibility? Is it a goal that you are sure you can hit, or a goal that you're ambitious you can hit?
Well, it's a goal I'm sure I can hit if we get the right amount of funding. So just as with the first Human Genome Project that put $3 billion into the human genome effort, we'll be approaching the federal government to ask for billions of dollars to create the infrastructure that's necessary to carry out this million-person project.
And okay, so you ask for the money. Where does the money go? Like, what are some of the compartments
So
that?
so for the million-person project, there are 5 major things you have to be able to do. So one is to recruit 1 million patients and their physicians to this kind of a study. And that means education and consenting patients and automating that. Then the second thing is taking the samples every 6 months from the patients and putting them in a biobank. And from the biobank, then sending them to vendors that do the DNA sequencing and the protein analysis and the microbiome analysis and the digital health measurements. And then we want to acquire this data plus the electronic health records of each patient and put it in the cloud and be able to analyze this information and get actionable possibilities that will change how we do healthcare. It will attract patients from across the healthcare spectrum to use this powerful new data ecosystem. And it will usher in a whole new arena of clinical trials using dense, data-rich approaches, which will allow us to dramatically reduce the number of patients needed in clinical trials and multiply by thousands of fold the amount of information we get from clinical trials. So we think this will then transform every aspect of healthcare. So we'd like to be able to extend the wellness most people experience. Ultimately, we'd like to extend it up so that you move into your 90s physically capable and mentally acute. We'd love to be able to identify the earliest wellness to disease transitions that happen in individuals and reverse them. And finally, if you do get a disease, we want to take really detailed systems-driven precision medicine approaches to curing diseases. And one that we're really studying in some detail now is Alzheimer's disease.
Mm-hmm. And what have you found through your research with Alzheimer's?
Well, what is utterly clear is in the last 14 years or so, there have been close to 500 clinical trials. All 500 have failed. So it means people are really looking at Alzheimer's in the wrong way, at least up until very recently. And so one of my science colleagues, Dale Bredesen, started taking a systems approach to thinking about Alzheimer's. And he optimized how to maximize the communication between nerve cells effectively, something that's lost in Alzheimer's. And that led to what's called a multimodal therapy, where he realized you had to improve your diet, your exercise, your sleep, your blood metabolites and vitamins. You had to get rid of, in some cases, toxins like black mold. And so it meant you had to make a lot of measurements in these patients, and then replace whatever was deficient. And the important thing is for each individual, the diet, the exercise, and so forth are uniquely adapted to what the individual is. It isn't a one size fits all. And that, of course, is true of replacing missing supplements in the blood and vitamins and things like that. And the preliminary clinical trials from a number of groups are very promising in this regard. And I think this multimodal therapy is going to be the way to go in the future.
Yeah.
But in the initial study of 5,000 individuals we did for a 4-year period, we were able to see more than 150 wellness to disease transitions. We looked at 5 of those that transitioned to cancer, and we looked at the 1,200 blood analytes that we'd analyzed, and we were able to show for all 5, there were outlier blood analytes that gave us a clue as to where the earliest transition occurred. So that's a marker for where you should attempt to reverse the disease at its very earliest stage. And that can be 5 or 10 years before the disease ever manifests itself. And that's certainly true of Alzheimer's, for example. So we'd like to be able to have a preventive medicine where we follow your health trajectory and those of 340 million other Americans, and we pick up these transitions at the earliest point and reverse them so you never get sick. So it could deal with Alzheimer's, it could deal with major chronic diseases in the future, cardiovascular, diabetes, and the like. And this is kind of the promise that is going to come from analyzing these million patients over this 8-year period of time or so.
Wow, that's incredible. I first learned about your work through actually the first guest I ever had on this podcast, which is Azra Raza, a doctor at Columbia University.
Oh, I know her well.
Yeah,
Yes.
she wrote a book called The First Cell, and which I sympathize with a lot because we have the same method of treating cancer that we did 50 years ago. She calls us, I think it's slash cut burn.
Yep.
So the fact that nothing has changed, we're still doing the same thing, means we need to find the first cell instead of dealing with the issue when it's already advanced and
Yep.
most likely beyond the pale.
Yep.
Why, in your opinion, has wellness, as you describe it, not been more emphasized in medicine until, well, your work and the work of a few other researchers?
Well, I think in medicine, the most obvious thing is disease. When you get sick, it demands your attention. So medicine just very naturally gravitated toward being able to deal with disease. And that's been true from medicine's inception up until very recently. And it's only been in the last 20 years or so that people have started to say, hey, there's this other dimension of healthcare called wellness that we've really ignored. And of course, in the young, it's not a problem because the young think they're immortal, think they're going to be healthy and effective forever. And it's only when you get into middle age, you start having these wellness to disease transitions and you begin to realize you're mortal. So part of the challenge for wellness is we should start optimizing wellness when you're an infant and follow it all the way through. But how to get medicine and healthcare to pay for wellness is an enormous challenge because doctors get paid for treating patients. They don't get paid for keeping them well. And the same is true of insurance companies. So we have to realign the incentives completely from a healthcare that is now disease care, really, to a healthcare that's predominantly wellness care.
How do you begin to revise those incentives?
I think the way you can revise the incentives is to persuade payers to pay for value-based medicine. And what that means is they should start paying physicians to keep their patients well and healthy rather than paying only after they get diseased and take care of them. And keeping people well is going to save the healthcare system hundreds of billions of dollars in the end, and it's going to be really transformational. So to give you an example, there are 6.2 million people with Alzheimer's disease in the US today. Collectively, they cost about $260 billion a year to treat. And they require another $250 billion for the loss of their caretakers' income and savings and things like that. So it's more than $500 billion for one disease. So let's suppose we could take high-risk Alzheimer's patients that hadn't transitioned and follow them using the approaches I've described of genome and phenome analyses and find the earliest Alzheimer's transition and get biomarkers for it. And then what we could do is on an annual basis, check with that biomarker whether people had transitioned. And if they did, we'd put them immediately into this multi-mode preventive kind of therapy. And in principle, in a 10 or 15 year period, I think we could do away with 80–85% of Alzheimer's disease. Now, figure the savings you'd get from that one disease alone. It's staggering.
Yeah. Wow. I don't want to sound cynical, but I think I have to, because a lot of the times it seems, and I brought this up with Oscar Raza as well, it seems that insurance companies and doctors just care about, well, maybe not doctors, let's put insurance companies, care more about treating people, quote unquote treating, prescribing them things because it makes money. Same thing with cancer treatment, right? So somebody with stage 3 or stage 4 cancer could potentially live for another year, year and a half, 2 years, probably longer. But there's a huge financial gain that these companies get from treating these people. Again, it's very hard, I think, to reverse the incentives. I'm not saying we shouldn't, I'm saying we should, but it's very difficult to reverse the incentives to what you're advocating for. I think the concern is always for doctors that they want to get paid fairly for their work, and maybe they won't. I don't know. It's a hell of a project you took on.
Look, I'll tell you what my answer to that conundrum would be is the following. We're going to ask for the resources to carry out over this 8-year period of time the analyses of these million people as we've described. And the government will pay for it as it paid for the first Human Genome Project. The data will be available. We'll be able to prove we can reverse Alzheimer's and many cardiovascular diseases and diabetes in really effective, powerful ways. The way you convince people to change is to show your approach really works. And what this means, all you have to do is to show payers, look, if we focus on wellness with these strategies, and the strategies would include this scientific wellness, and we're going to be doing clinical trials on how you age in a very healthy fashion and so forth, we can argue that you can save literally hundreds of billions of dollars. And as a payer, you can't afford not to do that. Rather, you would take this value-based approach and say to the physicians, we're going to pay you to keep these people well, and we'll make an enormous amount of money doing that, saving in a lot of things now that cost us horrendous costs, and being able to pay for the assays that will allow you to follow each individual with this data-driven approach and everything. So I think the way to get around skepticism is success. And I think the way to get success is to have the government fund a program that proves these principles unequivocally. And physicians in the healthcare system will absolutely move toward accepting them then. See, right now, it's very easy as we start pushing wellness as a major means of saving healthcare dollars. It's they'll say, show me the clinical trials, show me the proof. And after an 8-year period, we'll have effectively the clinical trials and proof. I mean, what this strategy is going to do is take something like cardiovascular disease and be able to stratify it not into 2 or 3 major types, but into 15 or 20 major types. And with pharma, we'll take each of those subtypes and learn the appropriate therapy that's going to be effective in that subtype at the earliest detectable stage. And so it's thinking about medicine in very different ways, and we're going to have to prove those ways are really effective.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of maybe people in the private sector too that I've heard want to invest money in living longer. So this seems to me like a very promising way to fulfill that goal. So if you, from a young age, get your genome traced, correct? I hope I'm not
Right?
messing this up.
Yeah.
And you get to have personalized healthcare, which is the goal. You have personalized healthcare from a young age. You should probably live no problem to like 100 years old. And that's
well, and to be fully functional. That's the really important part. We don't want you to be sick and alien and ill. And what's interesting about people that go into their hundreds is when they die, they often die with total systems failure very quickly. So they don't spend a lot of the family's income in dragging out their lives and so forth. So we'd like with this approach to get you fully functional up to 100 or so. And when you move into higher ages, to have you die quickly. It's a very efficient process. But the other thing healthy aging will do, it may well push the average long lifespan from the 90s now out into the hundreds or 110s and still have you be functional. Now, some people may say, gosh, am I going to get bored or am I going to run out of money? Living a long time raises a lot of non-trivial problems for individuals. But on the other hand, it gives you the opportunity to be creative and generative and excited about life. And clearly, we'll have to learn I mean, if we get everybody living into the hundreds and we still retire at 65, government's going to run out of money in no time flat. So we're going to have to change the sociology of retirement and people's attitudes toward what retirement should be.
right. Say, can a person just join this movement right now or no?
Well, we're going to have to do it through hospital systems where we can capture the electronic health records because those are really key. So initially, it'll probably be through places like Providence, and a place we'll collaborate with, interact with is Guardian Network, and in the South and in the Midwest with 7 major healthcare centers and so forth. But what we're going to try and do very early on is to be able to reach out with the best of these practices to consumers and bring them into these possibilities. And how quickly we can do that, we're a little uncertain. But the idea is we want to be able to reach out to virtually anyone that's interested in uh, being able to participate in this really revolutionary approach to healthcare.
Yeah, I was very interested to read that you also believe that a disease like diabetes is reversible. Is it reversible prior to getting it, or um, after you already have it? Well, what I was really interested to read when I was researching your work is the fact that you believe that diabetes could be reversed as well. Is that before people get diabetes, or is it while they have it?
So I think early diabetes absolutely can be reversed if you are intense enough in treatment. Okay. But ideally, we'd like to again have these markers that detect it very early and get it reversed there, because the earlier you detect it, the easier it is to reverse it.
Mhm.
But once it gets beyond a certain chronic stage, then things are no longer reversible because you've done irreversible damage to the kidneys and the pancreas and the other organs involved.
Right.
So I think with most chronic diseases, we'll want it, we'll want to do them years before the disease can be detected. But even in the early stages of most chronic diseases, we'll develop the techniques for reversing them.
Yeah. If you don't mind, I want to get a little maybe personal. You mentioned the fact that your wife was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, um, and that kind of led you on this you know towards this movement and preventing it for to
Right.
generate to other generations of people. Um, what did you learn seeing your wife go through Alzheimer's?
Well, she was diagnosed in 2005. And what I saw is a person who gradually slipped away in terms of intellectual abilities initially. For example, she had decided shortly before the diagnosis that she wanted to move from a very large, nice home we had on Lake Washington to a condo in downtown Seattle, because she said, frankly, she thought uh, managing a large place was just not what she wanted to do. And more likely, it was she just couldn't do it anymore. And I remember when we moved in the past, she'd organized everything about moves. And in this one, she couldn't at all. I had to do the full thing. And, you know, over the years, for the next, I'd say 5 or 6 years, she gradually became more forgetful. She became less interested in reading. In 2011 or 12, I hired a caretaker that could spend a lot of time with her because I was still working full time and everything. And then in about 2015, her abilities became so compromised, and that's with regard to toiletry and things like that, that we had to move her into a home. And it was a wonderful home with a lot of activities, but you know, she gradually has slid downhill to her current status now, where she's really in the final stages of this disease. And I think what's tragic about it is you see a vivacious, engaged, enthusiastic person gradually fade away and become silent, uh, incapable of talking, and then incapable of probably recognizing people and things like that too. And, the family has all gone through this, and it's been a challenge.
Yeah.
And
Hasn't.
I have the means that she can get the best care, but for average families, I remember going to a meeting of 11 caretakers just to see what the experience was like for other people. And 6 of them said, "This has totally taken control of my life. I'm spending all our family income and savings. I just want it to be over. I don't want to live like this." And that's what happens to caretakers. They end up spending their entire life taking care of the individual that they love. And so the really key thing, what I decided in 2005 with my wife's diagnosis, is I'd learn all about Alzheimer's, and I did learn about it, and realized very quickly that the therapies were utterly inadequate, and that a new kind of thinking was necessary for Alzheimer's. And that came to be this multimodal therapy that came right out of a systems approach to thinking about Alzheimer's by Dale Bredesen. And and uh, and it's taken a while to have the clinical trials to start to begin to prove that this is going to be a powerful way to approach Alzheimer's. In fact, we have now 3 clinical trials that we've organized and are going in Alzheimer's, and we're confident that we're going to get really fascinating results over the next few years with these kind of trials. And that's why I cautiously hope in a 10-year period that we can do very substantial transformation in the whole arena of Alzheimer's, with early prevention and reversal that will let us deal with most Alzheimer's diseases early.
Mhm. Um, the overarching theme of this conversation, you talk about a lot about systems teaching, uh, and systems learning, obviously, and uh, you believe that every student K through 12 should have an education or be taught systems teaching. How does that has that been implemented? Is that in the works, and what would that look like?
Well, I'll tell you, when I back even before I started the Institute for Systems Biology, we had partnered with the Seattle School District from K through 12 to teach science to students at all of these different levels. And we used a inquiry-based kind of science. We set up a materials center that let teachers have wonderful materials for teaching hands-on inquiry-based science. And I think we taught the teachers how to do it, who in turn taught the students. And I think it really had a transformational effect on science education. More recently, I've written a textbook on systems biology, and one of the chapters in this textbook is on P4 medicine. And we're now setting up a high school course for health classes that includes 20 different modules on what P4 medicine is and how you should think about this new kind of healthcare. And I think when those kids graduate with that understanding from high school, they'll have more understanding of that approach than 90% of the physicians that exist in the clinical world today. So I think the teaching is incredibly important. We set up some systems biology teaching materials and modules that we made available across the internet. And over a period of 10 years or so, we can say now that they're being used in every state in the union and they've been used by students in more than 100 different countries. So these materials can really have a big impact on science education, not only locally, but across the US and in fact across the world. And we hope exactly the same will happen with this course we're developing on P4 healthcare and P4 medicine.
Yeah. So you're obviously a very esteemed scientist. I think you got the I always forget what the medal was called from Barack Obama, the National
Medal of Science.
Medal of Science. Yes, correct.
Yeah.
And there are obviously a future generation of scientists maybe listening to this podcast, maybe people need advice at all times, and they need reassurance that, you know, that what they're doing is worth it. What advice would you give aspiring scientists? And this is a two-part question. What was the best advice you got as a young scientist?
Yeah. Well, I would say it's really important to follow your passions and to always have fun. And if science is what makes you passionate and excited, that is a terrific career to follow. I would say if you're interested in becoming a biologist or a medical researcher, I think things that are absolutely critical are, one, learning a lot of computational tools about how to deal with information, and especially how to manage large sets of data and things like that. I think biologists in the future, whether they're experimental or more theoretical, are absolutely going to have to be able to manipulate information and analyze it and model it and do things like that. But I think it's also very important to take a systems view of science that is global and holistic and capable of looking in enormous detail at what the information tells you about complexity and understanding how that information can be converted into the biological networks that underpin, development and aging and disease and all of these kinds of things. So I think getting a modern education in biology, and if I were a young student thinking of going into biology today, I think the ideal major is bioengineering. You learn about biology and engineering and computation and mathematics and technology, and those are all the kinds of things that you need to understand well, but then you need to have a problem that gets you excited and passionate. And the final thing I would say is what really makes science fun is dealing with really excellent colleagues. So you should choose to go to schools that give you excellent students and excellent professors. And when you go out and start your research career, you want to be in an exciting environment that's going to challenge and make you grow in unusual ways. And the final bit of advice that I always give to students is, if you look at the career of the typical scientist, they go up to a peak and then almost all of them kind of fade away and go down. But I found in my career that if you get up near a peak and then you change careers in a fundamental way, you get young and passionate, enthusiastic and insecure again, and you learn a lot more and you go up another exponential, and then you change it again, and the same thing can continue to happen. So changing careers and exposing yourself to new opportunities is really a critical part of maintaining passion for science and effectiveness in your accomplishments.
Mhm. Obviously, you touched on it a little bit, but what gets you out of bed every morning? Are there I would imagine there are days where you're uh, maybe something, down on your luck or thinking that things aren't happening quickly enough. But what gets you out of bed every morning?
So I always think things aren't happening quickly enough. And I'm always disappointed that something isn't moving as I like it. But what really gets me up in the morning is this exciting idea that with my colleagues, I'm participating in an endeavor that is absolutely going to transform healthcare in the 21st century. And it's going to make possible for people to live and be well and to be productive and creative for extended periods of time. And it's going to transform the healthcare system from a disease orientation to a wellness orientation. And we're going to learn how to optimize the aging process so you can feel young and enthusiastic and excited well into your 70s and 80s. And I can say, I'm in that category and I still feel young and excited.
Wonderful. The last two questions I ask of all my guests, I'm going to wrap them into one. You answer whatever order you please. The first one is, what gives you hope for the future? It could be as general or as future or as narrow as you please. And the second question is, what are 5 books on any topic, fiction, nonfiction, whatever, that you would recommend to people?
Okay. So, what makes me happy and excited is the passion, enthusiasm, and talents of young students as I interface with them. And seeing these young, talented people that have the ability to look at science in dramatically new ways and to get excited about things that I may even be skeptical about and then prove me wrong. But I think as you age, what is really critical is to maintain your connection with youth and its passion and enthusiasm and excesses. And that's what one of the things that really excites me. Okay, as to books, one of the most striking books I read recently is called a book by a Harvard professor called The End of Average. And what he did was talk about business, about sports, and about education, and many other things in the context that many of them in the past had been approached by taking the average of big populations and applying it to education or development. And the beautiful example that he gave was airline pilots and how you fix the cockpit for them. And what happened in the early days of airlines was the cockpits were all fixed. So if you were big, they didn't fit. If you were little, they didn't fit. And it was a nightmare and it caused a lot of crashes. And then a sociologist came along and said, well, look, the average that we've made the cockpits for is represented very infrequently in the whole population. They're either bigger or smaller. So let's design the cockpits so you can adjust all the critical things according to your height and weight and all those things. And immediately that decreased the number of crashes. So the idea that the individual is the unit of action and activity is important. And again, in education, that's really correct too. I mean, you can give kids an average education, or you can try and teach to each of the individual students and let them go at their own pace and their own activity. And the same is true in business. I mean, you know, when Henry Ford designed the production line for cars, it was absolutely fixed and it didn't work for a lot of people. And so again, flexibility was built into this kind of thing. And in medicine, all of the past has been taking a big average population, finding out kind of what worked on average, and then applying that to every single individual. And in glaring repeat success after success, we can show that isn't going to work. We have to look at the individuals and not at the whole populations themselves. So that's one. I think a second book by David Sinclair is Lifespan. And he gives a discussion of aging and, you know, basically makes a number of really fascinating arguments. One, the process for aging has been conserved from the most primitive single-celled organism up to humans. Therefore, it's a relatively simple process. So that's a startling idea. And number two, the idea that in a sense, aging is really a disease, but what's exciting is it's a disease that can be greatly slowed or perhaps even reversed. And that's really a revolutionary idea. And one of the points he makes is because the aging process is relatively simple, there may be very simple drugs that can strikingly affect the aging process. And they're exploring now things like rapamycin and metformin as two possibilities that attacked different pillars in this relatively simple aging process. So will it be possible in the future that to take drugs that will keep you relatively young? And the third interesting idea, of course, is the most predominant genetic sociologic factor for all chronic diseases is your age. As you get older, you increase the likelihood of all the major chronic diseases. Well, let's suppose we can really stop or incredibly slow your aging. Does that mean we're not going to run into all of these chronic diseases then? Really a very exciting kind of idea. So it's a book that that I would argue is worth thinking about. A third one is a book called The Empty Planet, written by an economist and a sociologist. And this puts forward the very interesting thesis that the world, the developed world, and the countries in the developed world already are below replacement rate in population. And that means their populations are going to be going down in the future. And Japan is absolutely the primary example of that. But the US is an example. In this last census, our population for the first time in a gazillion years went down, actually. And the book further says that one of the very major factors that's moving toward a declining population is the education of women. Because when women got educated, they were interested in professions. They were less interested in marriage, and they certainly weren't interested in marriages that were hierarchical where the men ruled. So for example, young women in Japan aren't particularly interested in getting married because they want to have their own life not dictated to by a male. And the argument is this is starting to happen now in the developing world. And the argument of the book is that indeed the population in both developed and developing nations is going to start to go down. And within a 50-year period, we may see really striking decreases in population in many countries. And one they singled out is China, because China, with the one-child rule for so long, really started this negative replacement trend in China. And the argument is, once it's negative, it's really hard to turn around. So the idea is, how are we going to deal with a world where we have declining populations? And, you know, one of the very interesting things they pointed out is the US, even though it has a declining replacement number, has been almost saved from this kind of challenge, because we were so open about immigration and we brought so many people in as replacements. And of course, with the last administration and its attitudes, it's been a disaster for immigration of all types. And they argued that immigration, where it's possible, is one way to ameliorate these kinds of challenges. So anyway, that's another book. I mean, gosh, I've read so many books over that.
They don't have to be your favorite books, by the way. They could be any books you want. Just recommend.
Oh, no. I'm just trying to think of the most fascinating books that changed how I thought about things. I think those are really the interesting ones. The next book, I'd argue, is a book called 100-Year Life. And what this book showed in a really simple way is that over the last 200 years, we've had more or less a linear increase in lifespan that appears to be going on in a relatively unabated fashion. So, and there's some real truth in that. So the interesting question is, if that is the case, and many of us can, and for example, in 2007, they stated, for the first time ever, they made the extrapolation that 50% of the children born had a very good chance of living to be 100, okay? So the question is, if lots of people are living to be 100, what kind of things do you have to worry about? Well, what the book didn't discuss, and it was the most serious remiss aspect of the book, is it's utterly critical that you optimize healthy aging and wellness. So if you get up into your 90s and 100s and everything, you're functional and useful and everything. That aside, they pointed out that, you know, for most people who retire at 65 and have just a single job, that isn't going to be possible anymore. One, because lots and lots of the jobs we have today in 20 years won't even exist. So you're going to have to be able to adapt to change jobs and continue living. And more than that, you're going to have to give up the idea of retirement at 65, because if you do, you won't begin to have enough money to live in a reasonable fashion out to 100 or so. And they also make the point that how you re-educate and make these transitions is really going to be key. They make the point that in the end, a key part of healthy aging, which is true, is community. It's interaction with people. What tends to happen with the older is they lose their friends, they lose their relatives, and it's critical that you maintain vital connections with younger people and in your family and in your friends and the like. So it's a book that makes you think about the sociology of aging and how we're going to want to think about it in a very different way in the future.
Mhm.
And the last book I'll talk about is a very thin book that is called The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge. And the idea there is that fundamental basic science is the infinite creative source of dramatic new opportunities in the future. And they cite radio, they cite television, they cite the internet as all things, the electric light bulb, as all things that started out from a very theoretical point of view, but they opened possibilities that transformed how we live today. And this book is really about a very fascinating character called Flexner, Abner Flexner, who in 1910 wrote a report called the Flexner Report, where he reviewed 155 medical schools in the US and Canada and showed that they were deplorable trade schools, and it was a disaster to be created them. And he argued two things had to change. One, you had to bring science into medicine, and two, you had to bring science into teaching physicians. And, enterprising schools like Johns Hopkins jumped on this, and that was the first big revolution in medicine. And Flexner then went on to do many other interesting things, new approaches to teaching. And his last crowning achievement was the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, where he brought superb scholars in many different fields together. And there, all sorts of things were invented that were translated into major activities in modern society and everything. So, excuse me. Anyway, so that's 5 books. And those are, if you read those, they will change your attitudes in so many different ways and directions that it'll be exciting. Let me say that my own view is that the second major paradigm change in the last 110 years in healthcare is exactly what I've talked about. The idea that we can look at the individual health trajectory of an individual and optimize it. That simple idea is a transformational idea, a paradigm change.
Yeah. I cannot begin to say this enough. Thank you for coming onto the podcast, for sharing these ideas, for doing the work you do and continue to do. I hope you get to do it for the next 50 years.
At least. The other thing is, one of the things we've learned to do is measure your biological age. And I'm a fanatic for diet and exercise, and I was overjoyed to learn I'm 15 years younger than my chronologic age. So it means Wonderful. I'm aging extremely well. So anyway, it's been a pleasure talking with you, and I wish you the best of luck.
Yeah, same here. Thank you very much.
Okay, cheers.